study looking at invasive annual grasses in the West, specifically ventenata, medusahead, and cheatgrass. So our panelists will look at the impacts from a variety of these terrestrial grasses on our Western landscapes. So we have Dr. Jane Mangold, who is an associate professor and extension invasive plant specialist with Montana State University. We have Dr. Brian Mueller, director and associate professor of Sheridan Research Extension Center. Justin Hossfeld, president of Sunlight Ranches, and finally Dave Burch, state weed coordinator for Montana Department of Agriculture. So I would like to start with you, Jane.
All right, thank you, Leah, and good morning, everybody. It's a real honor to be at this workshop and have the issue of biosecurity and invasive species raised to the level that we're talking about today. So the story that I would like to share about invasive annual grasses in Montana and the Northern Rockies and Northern Great Plains actually begins with a story about actually begins with a story about invasive plants that are not grasses. Some of the more popular ones shown on this slide, species like leafy spurge, spotted knapweed, Canada thistle, salt cedar, tamarisk, and many others. And these are what we refer to as, invasive forbs or broad-leaved plants. And it's interesting to note that the majority of the species that are listed on state noxious weed lists are these types of species and not grasses. So just as an example, I looked at two states, the states that are represented on our panel here today, Montana and Wyoming, and in those two states, there's 30 to 35 species on the state noxious weed list. And you'll notice that in Montana, there's one grass, and in Wyoming, there's 3 grasses. And 3 of these 4 have just been added to the noxious weed list in the last couple years. So these grasses are only making up 3 to 10% of high priority species in the states. Yet I went back and looked at just looked at the presentations that I've given over the last 10 years. That's the time I've been in my position at Montana State. And about 30% of my presentations have been on invasive annual grasses at the request of people that we want to know about these species. So there's a lot of interest in these species. Yet there's a lot of interest in annual grasses, yet they're not necessarily represented well on our noxious weed lists. And for many, many decades, we've been doing a great job of educating our citizens and actively managing these broad-leaved invasive plants, but we maybe haven't been doing as good of a job focusing on annual grasses. And what we're now faced with in a lot of situations are these invasive annual grasses. So there's 4 grasses listed here that are of primary concern in Montana, and I would say the Northern Great Plains and Northern Rockies as well. Cheatgrass, Japanese brome, they've been around a long time. We've been dealing with these for a long time. And then more recently, medusahead and ventenata. So the panel, we thought it'd be helpful to just quickly go over the biology of these species because it will help us kind of understand why they are so successful. So all 4 of these grasses are winter annual grasses, and what that means is in the fall, the seeds germinate and emerge, and those plants stay in a seedling stage through the winter, fall through winter. And then by late winter to early spring, they're growing. As soon as the soil starts warming just even a little bit, these annual grasses start growing again, increasing their root and leaf area. And then usually by late spring to early summer, they're flowering and producing mature seeds. And by midsummer, the plant itself dies. The seeds go on to produce the next generation again in the fall. So these plants are kind of making their living by completing their life cycle early in the season when there's plenty of soil moisture before we start hitting that droughty seasonal period that we see by midsummer. And they tend to outcompete some of our native perennial grasses because of this. Some of the impacts of these grasses from a livestock and wildlife management perspective, they produce low quality forage, and that the forage is unpredictable in terms of how much you get in a given year because their growth is really influenced by annual precipitation. As this picture shows, this is medusahead. They can displace native species and form monocultures. They have also been found to alter how nutrients are cycled in the soil, and they can alter wildfire patterns, changing the size of wildfires, the frequency, and also extending the wildfire season because they cure out and dry out earlier in the summer. As I mentioned earlier, ventenata and medusahead have rapidly been increasing in Montana and Wyoming as well. And for many, many years, we've talked about cheatgrass because it's been a problem in the Great Basin in the western U.S. since the 1940s, 1950s. But these two species have received far fewer attention. So a year or so ago, we actually did a survey of Montana ranchers to try to gain a handle on how familiar they are with the 4 annual invasive grasses that we have in Montana. And here's some of those results. And we see here that everybody that responded to our survey had heard of cheatgrass. And about 92% of the people said they could identify it in the field. They felt comfortable doing that. A little less so with Japanese brome. But when you look at ventenata and medusahead on the far right of this graph, only about 28 to 35% of the people surveyed had heard of it, and most of them had not heard of it, or they could not identify it in the field. In that same survey, we asked Montana ranchers, how are you dealing with invasive annual grasses? The broad majority of ranchers that answered this question, 44%, are using targeted grazing to deal with annual grasses, primarily cheatgrass and Japanese brome, followed by herbicide. Somewhat alarmingly, but I didn't find it too surprisingly, just based on discussions I've had with people, is that about 30% of ranchers are not managing their invasive annual grasses at all. So some of the constraints to management of these grasses, they are challenging to manage. One possible constraint relates back to my first slide of this presentation, is that other weeds are higher priority. Think about the species that are listed on a state noxious weed list versus not noxious. There's also just a lack of information and effective tools for dealing with these species. It's very difficult to selectively remove an undesirable grass from the desirable grasses that we have making up the broad majority of our rangeland and prairie systems in this part of the region. And then cost is also a constraint, particularly in those areas where these grasses are widespread. Now you notice those first 2 bullets have an asterisk at the end of them. It's interesting that there was also a survey done in Wyoming and Colorado. Wendy Kelly was the primary author on this paper. And they identified those top 2 constraints as primary constraints to dealing with annual grasses. So I'd like to talk, just my last couple points here have to do with the cost of control. In the survey that we ran about a year ago, the people that responded to that survey estimated spending about 93 cents per acre per year on annual grass management. That was a fairly small survey. We only had 118 people respond. But a couple years ago, we did a larger survey looking at the impacts of noxious weeds, so all those other species that we're dealing with in terrestrial systems, a little larger sample size. And in that survey and economic analysis, people were spending about 91 cents per acre, so pretty similar amounts. In that analysis, we were also able to figure in the amount of forage that was lost due to noxious weeds. So if you calculate or add up the cost of controlling plus the cost of lost forage, it was about $1.33 per acre per year. Now that doesn't sound like very much, but if you start thinking about the size of grazing units that ranchers are dealing with, the average size of a unit in our survey was a little over 5,000 acres. So that was about $6,700 per year that noxious weeds were costing a respondent in our survey. And if you tallied that across the total acreage represented in our survey across those 182 respondents, it was $850,000 in direct costs of noxious weeds. So if you think about that value plus the impact that these annual grasses may be having in terms of cost of control and possibly lost forage, it is a fairly sizable number. And I have that, we did publish that second survey. The citation is there if anybody's interested. So that's what I have to share with you. Thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back to Leah for the other panel members.
Great, thank you, Jane. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Brian Mueller, Director and Associate Professor with Sheridan Research and Extension Center. Brian.
Thank you. I am very happy to be here, and thank you to the organizing committee for your commitment to invasive species across the U.S. I am here partly on behalf of the University of Wyoming, but a little bit more so on behalf of the Northeast Wyoming Invasive Grasses Working Group. And for my remarks, I'm going to give you a little bit of background around how this group was formed and what was the impetus for this group, and give you an update on the situation that we're dealing with two of the invasive grasses that Jane so clearly described, ventenata and medusahead, and then touch a little bit on some of the lessons that I think we are learning as we move forward with this process. As you can see here, our primary goal is really to minimize the impacts of these two new invasive grass species in the state of Wyoming, and I'll give you a little bit more background on how quickly this thing is developing and some of the challenges that I feel like we've been running into. And I'm going to touch at the end on all of the partners that are involved, and I'm probably going to end up talking a little bit more about people and relationships than I am about science and weeds, and that's sort of a new thing for me, so bear with me on that. In 2016, June of 2016, we did not know that we had either medusahead or ventenata self-sustaining populations of either species in the state of Wyoming. Mid-June, we found and documented ventenata, and the more we looked, the more we found. In August of 16, one of our partners in what has now become this working group called and said they found medusahead in the same location, which is in Sheridan County, and I'll show a map here pretty soon. So in a period of about 3 months, we went from not knowing, or basically operating under the assumption that we had neither of these two highly impactful invasive annual grasses in the state of Wyoming, to knowing that we had both of them and that they were self-sustaining. So from the context of early detection, rapid response, the pertinent questions would be, were these actually early detections? And I can answer the question of whether we had rapid response. So with a report of medusahead on August 6th of 2016, we were able to mobilize with partners of the group and do an aerial herbicide application the first week of September on publicly owned lands. And so we were able to get an early, or at least a rapid response within that first year. The picture was dramatically changed and continued to develop as we moved through that, and it's a bit of a contrast between the two species. And medusahead is definitely still, we feel like, an early detection rapid response at the local level, and ventenata is a little bit more widespread than we thought. And come to find out, it was actually first recorded in the state in 1997. It was collected by a botanist and archived in the Rocky Mountain Herbarium, and there was no follow-up that was done. It was recorded on a piece of property that had limited public access, and I think part of that portion of the story goes back to what Jane kind of mentioned. These grasses are difficult to identify. And I think a lot of people would ride by in a truck or on horseback and just assume it was yet another patch of Japanese brome or cheatgrass. And so that's been one of the primary efforts that we've had, is sharing educational resources on how to identify these species. So primary objectives for the working group really are to clearly understand the distribution of the targets, and to try to identify their potential for spread in our region. I'll talk about why it's important in our region a little bit more. To develop and implement management strategies that include treating and monitoring known infestations, and really to share information across boundaries and with people that make decisions and that actively manage the landscape. So I mentioned it's a little bit important that it's in the region and it's new. The X there is kind of the epicenter of where we're working. And if you'll notice, it's in the center of really the Great Plains ecoregion, whereas almost all the literature and almost all the work that's been done with these two species previously has been done farther west in the cold deserts and the Great Basin type areas. So we started with a very basic question of, are they really going to be problematic in a Great Plains ecoregion? And I think that question answered itself very clearly the more that we started to look. And yet the question still remains as to whether management strategies and approaches, including timing, tactics, and tools that have shown some promise in the Great Basin, will still work for us in this part of the country. The other reason why I think it's important to point this out is that if you think about early detection rapid response as a modular approach, and you think about that we're the first known locations in the Great Plains ecoregion, the potential for spread into those regions is much larger. Blue dots represent medusahead infestation, so the line at the top of the screen is the Wyoming-Montana border. Relatively small area overall. Blue stars are confirmed medusahead locations in 2016 based on intensive survey data. Green stars are medusahead locations that were confirmed in, no, those are 17, and then green stars are 18. Our approach with medusahead to this point in time is to treat every known acre of medusahead that we have. So the orange polygon overlays show herbicide treatments that have occurred up to this point in time. Somewhere around 5,000 acres of total treatment area targeted at medusahead. Now, if we look at ventenata, I said the story's a little bit different. We're going to zoom back out. It may be hard for you to see in the back of the room. The small, bright green polygons are those areas that I just showed you. If we connect the dots on ventenata, and I'll say that the part that goes up into Montana is not accurate. That was just sort of a guess. We're pushing nearly 2 million acres of the distribution. So we went from, in a 2-year period, went from not thinking we had any to somewhere around 2 million acres that we're trying to wrap our minds around. And so the approach with that is much more find the edges and implement containment. And it's still definitely early detection rapid response approach. It's just at the statewide and regional level much more so than it is at the local level. So I want to talk a little bit, I'm almost out of time, about the importance of partnerships. Having the right people involved, and that includes everyone from individual landowners to agency personnel and other partners, is incredibly critical to this kind of effort. And part of that is directly associated to funding, but part of that's expertise and part of that's access. We think about funding from the National Invasive Species Council, and this is one of the pilot projects that's reported as a deliverable for their 16 to 18 strategic plan, all the way down to landowners like Justin, that you're going to hear more about their concerted effort, to just the people that are willing to go out and look for this stuff and report the findings from potentially a citizen science standpoint that help us develop a clear perspective on where it is so that we can then move forward with the implementation of a management strategy is incredibly crucial. So I will save other comments because I think I'm over time. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Perfect. Great. Next, we will hear from Justin Hossfeld, president of Sunlight Ranches. Justin.
Thank you. And again, like everyone, I'd like to thank the Western Governors Association and the organizing group for putting this together and allowing me to participate. It's an honor and it's very important. So I'm president of Sunlight Ranch. Sunlight Ranch is a ranching operation that operates in Montana and Wyoming. There's 11 ranches total. We're a cow-calf operation plus do backgrounding and a large farming operation. And so we work very hard to be understand the areas that we operate in, be good stewards and be good partners in the areas that we operate in. And so when Brian brought to our attention the ventenata and the medusahead, we were like many where we thought that, yeah, it's just another one of those weeds we got to watch for, and we already have too many to watch for. But thanks for telling us, Brian. And then we got out there and got to looking and found the same results that he had discovered, that we had both on our property and at an alarming rate, and at a much higher level of infestation than we thought. So also, I just want to quickly let John know that this study that I'm going to show you is on our Sunlight Ranch game farm unit, but it is no longer a game farm. It's no longer operating, so we're not at a potential risk for CWD, and I want to make sure and come out and say that. So what we've wanted to do from the Sunlight Ranch perspective is there's been so much great work done by Dr. Mangold and Dr. Mueller and others, the state and federal weed and pest organizations to help. We wanted to take that great work and build upon it. We wanted to take it from rapid identification, rapid response, but then also look at the economic payback, the economic viability, and the true effect that it has on a farming and ranching operation. So what we embarked upon, and we're working with another company in the area, is we knew that as we started to go out and scout these infestations of ventenata and medusahead, we found that they were very mosaic in how they were. There was no common sense, there was no pattern, there was no trend that we could immediately identify and how we were going to find them and treat them. And we were also found that it was very alarming, and I'll demonstrate a little bit later in my presentation, how quickly they spread. So that created this sense of urgency that we needed to get a very effective, a very quick, a very cost-effective means of identifying them, mapping them, and then analyzing our risk-reward on treatment. So we started to work with aerial photographs, with NDVI imagery, and multiple other ways to overlay the different data that we were getting to create these maps. And I think one of the bigger things that we wanted to get from this is since ventenata and medusahead spread so rapidly, we wanted to reduce our spread of ventenata and medusahead. And there was a lot of concern, and as you were roaring around with your hair on fire that the sky is falling and you have to find all this, you were probably spreading it way worse than you had it prior to when you started looking for it. And so this was some of the work we really, as we started to work on this project, we really wanted to delve in to perfecting our identification, our mapping, and our treatment process. So this is an example of where we used satellite imagery to locate the polygons that needed sprayed. Then we used high accuracy GPS guidance with a helicopter to treat those acres. The other key thing from this, and I'll maybe touch on it again when we start to talk about the funding and the affordability of treating these, or the return on investment from treating these pests, is the more accurate you are with your treatment, the more money you can save yourself in treatment. Everyone, when you look at helicopter application, everyone, they kind of cringe when they think about the price of helicopter application, but with the cost and the effectiveness of this herbicide, we found that the less you use can pay for the helicopter, can pay for more accurate application, be it helicopter, airplane, or even ground rigs, when you have accurate polygons that you can use to pinpoint the infestations. So this is a quick slide. I'll roll through this, but this is a case. This is one of the tests we started in This application was made in the fall of 2016, and using Esplanade, and we did multiple treatments. We did multiple rates of Esplanade with accompanying herbicides. Then we did some work with Plateau and MB906. We tried various different herbicides and treatment methods to see which were the most effective. But also from this, as you can see in this slide, we started to learn that this is a situation of the better it gets, the better it gets. that as Jane has talked about in her work in the past, and Brian has too, is that when you take those annual invasive grasses out, you can see the difference in that photo between what could be a natural fire break and what would not be a natural fire break. But also beyond that is we're starting to find that the relative feed value of the forage has a significant payback and has a significant benefit that really isn't calculated in when people start to look at their cost of treated acre, what is going to be their return on investment for their cost of treated acre. And so we're really starting to delve in and do testing on forage analysis, forage moisture. We're finding that forage is 2 to 4% higher in protein, 3 to 6% higher in moisture. When you have a forage later in the year that's higher in moisture, cattle do better on that. They're less reliant on the water tank. Your pasture rotations just get better. And so we're starting to really work on the whole ranch, the whole ranch impact of a treatment, not just on getting rid of the pest itself. So that's what that long story is about. So the next thing is this is kind of a quick summary of this case study, and there's so many layers there I can't get into all of them, but I'll just roll down through here. The first thing, and I really want to build on what Jane brought up earlier, this cannot be seen as spraying weeds. Every time you talk to a producer, they're like, more spraying weeds. And you cannot view that this way. What I see, this is pasture renovation. This is getting more ranch land without paying for it. This is not having to have another cowboy, not to have another pickup, not have to pay any more taxes. This is pasture renovation. This is reinvestment in a ranch. And as I presented this to livestock producers or to ranching operations, farm and ranching operations, I challenge them with this. You have, and I kind of baited a group that I had earlier in the year on this conversation because we were getting some pretty big rocks thrown at us when we started talking about the cost of using Esplanade and treating this. And I said, have any of you put any new corrals in recent years? And a few raised their hands and said, yes, they did. And I said, did you expect a payback from those corrals that fall? And, oh, no. He says, but they were great. We shipped cattle faster. We had less shrink. Less stress on the cattle. We just really love that investment in our new corrals. I said, this is exactly the same thing. When you look at treating these grasses, and when you look at your whole ranch, this is a fixed asset. This is an asset improvement. This is not an expense. This is not spraying weeds. And I think that's a key thing that I want everyone to take away from this is this is investing in your future and investing in your process, not just spending money on herbicide that you're mad you got to go put on. So it's for me to get. I'll give you kind of some numbers from our case study, and they will differ by ranch because some ranches have a higher infestation, takes more treatment to get a discernible effect, some have less. But in this particular ranch, we will need to treat 38 to 40% of that ranch for these grasses to feel good about our application. So then I took that on a per cow basis, what it cost us per animal unit to make that investment, and then I amortized that out over time for how this treatment pays back to the ranch. And so we found that on this particular ranch, it was about $60 per cow-calf unit to make this investment to improve the ranch grazing, the ranch grazing protocol, but it was only amortized out only about a 7% increase in annual expenses. Yet offered a 36% increase in gross revenue. Because with what a lot of times you want to talk, there'll be an ideal that with increased forage, then stocking rate is linear. And that's not the case when it comes to an actual farm operation. Stocking rate will run into a ceiling, and that's workforce, forage base, ability to calve cows, summer range, all the rest of those things will stop a stocking rate. But what I'm trying to, what we hope we can educate people on is it goes beyond stocking rate, the forage quality. With additional forage, you can do a more optimal pasture rotation. You don't abuse your riparian areas. You don't have to come in around the ranch headquarters and start feeding, because what we find is invasive annual grasses really start to dictate your pasture rotation. And that's the last thing you want when you're a grazing operation. You want to be able to do, whether you do a 3-year counter rotation or however you best decide to be a good steward of those resources, you don't want one dynamic within that resource dictating how you do that. And we find once those annual invasive grasses are removed, it really does open up opportunities and ways of grazing that you've never thought you've seen before. So that we really wanted to look at all those different things, from reduced feed cost to better body condition of a cow before you go into winter, and what that translates to. So as you can see in the results, our forage production on an untreated acre was about 740 pounds, excuse me, a little dyslexia, 740 pounds of available forage per acre. After treatment, we were sitting at 2,140 pounds per acre. Now, mind you, these were taken in 2018 with an application made the fall of 2016. So results are quick with this herbicide protocol. It's astonishing. I've been in the business my whole life and been exposed around herbicides my whole career, and I've never seen or been as excited about the consistency and the performance of a herbicide as we're seeing here. To boil this down further, prior to treatment, during what we call the grazing season, the summer grazing season, it would take 24 acres per cow to sustain her through that grazing season. After treatment, it only takes 8.4 acres to sustain her during that grazing season. So as we start to talk about return on investment, as we start to talk about payback, that really ties in well. So, and then the final thing, the economic outcome, the percent reduction in cost to winter we found on that particular ranch, both in the body condition score of the cow, that we didn't have to hit her quite as hard with resources to bring her into good condition to winter, and with more available feed, we found that we reduced our cost to winter that cow by 32%. As I mentioned earlier, we increased our gross revenue by 36%, and our years to recoup our initial investment was about 8.27 years. So really, when I look at that, if you're putting in a new calving shed, if you're buying a new tractor, if you're putting in a new set of corrals, you look at those at 15 and 20-year investments. I think this particular protocol and treating these invasive grasses have a very good payback and a very high return on investment. So one thing I want to show here, just real quickly, it kind of was fortuitous as I was talking with Brian. So if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that picture of those horses and mares with the mountain in the background. And that picture was taken in 2014, and you'll see there's no ventenata or medusahead in that pasture. This is that pasture in 2018. So that is its ability to spread. That is how pervasive and how incredibly impactful this grass can be on your operation. Okay, I think.
Great, thank you. Our final panelist is Dave Burch, State Weed Coordinator for Montana Department of Agriculture. Dave.
Thank you, Leah. I just wanted to, again, like everybody else, thank the Western Governors Association for this opportunity to come and talk to you guys. I'm going to show you how a weed gets listed in the state of Montana. It's a little bit of a process that we have. I think it's a very good process. And then also I want to show you from a state standpoint, where we're at with ventenata and medusahead. So we'll get into that. But I've worked for the Department of Agriculture for 18 years now as either state weed coordinator or grants coordinator. And prior to that, I was a county weed coordinator for 3 different counties. So coordination and cooperation has always been a key to me to making a successful program, and that's still the same key that needs to be happening today. I did like the other panel's discussion about that and the early detection, rapid response. That's what it's all about. So this is how our listing process works, and it might be a little hard to see for you guys, but we have every 2 years, every even number year, we accept petitions to be put into the Department of Agriculture. Going through those petitions, if they're submitted, and I usually have the cutoff date as September 30th of the even numbered years, and I really don't know why we do that, but it's worked out that way. So, Once I get the petitions in place, submitted to the department, then we form a natural weed listing group committee that consists of people from MSU, U of M, state and federal agencies, county weed districts, natural resource organizations, Montana Seed Growers Association, tribes, anybody that really wants to have a say in looking at what is petitioned to be placed on our noxious weed list. Have a voice at this table. Normally what will happen is if a petition comes in, we will go through a scientific review, either through MSU or the U of M, to either have Jane or Peter Rice from University of Montana have been doing our scientific reviews for us and getting all the facts and information that we need to know about that particular plant. The work group then convenes to discuss the reviews and discuss what we're going to try to do. This work group actually makes a recommendation to the to the director of the Department of Agriculture, and he has final say whether it gets pushed forward or it doesn't happen that year. So, the work group can also recommend not to have it listed, and which has been the case. And since we're talking about grasses, ever since I've been involved in this, cheatgrass has usually been petitioned to be put on the state noxious weed list. One of the reasons that we don't have it on there, well, there's two main reasons. One is you can't clean it out of seed, and the other is that the economic factor to put this on a county weed control district is kind of unreeling to have them be expected to pay for cheatgrass control out of a budget that's already strapped to begin with. So funding is an issue on a lot of these noxious weeds or weeds that are being listed. So if the director does make a decision to list a noxious weed or have it listed as a noxious weed, then we have to go through a rulemaking process, which takes 60 to 90 days to get that completed. So it's usually in the odd numbered years is when that usually comes about, if it's going to be listed or not. But through that rulemaking process, that does give everybody another opportunity to voice their concerns or their agreeance with putting that on the noxious weed list. It's kind of bad because in the even numbered years, of course, we have legislative session going on, so we really don't do any rulemaking between January and end of April until the legislators have left our town of Helena and we can get back to a semi-normal life. So, but that's how our listing process worked, and it's like I say, it's been very successful over the years. So moving on, medusahead is a priority 1A listed noxious weed. It got listed in 2017. Priority 1A means that you have to eradicate it, contain it, and do education on it to help people understand why they have it. But the main thing is try to eradicate it. Ventenata is not a listed noxious weed, and it can be, we're going to have discussions probably in December because the deadline is passed for a petition, but we're going to talk about reopening that and putting ventenata on at least in the discussions of whether we want to try to list it or not. So a weed is, as a statewide noxious weed by rule by the department, every county has to have that weed on their weed list as well. A district, though, can also have a weed listed on their local county weed district weed list, which many of them do, and I think there's 3 or 4 right now that either have it or are in the process of listing ventenata at a county level. So once it's listed on a county level, it can also then qualify for state funding through the Noxious Weed Trust Fund program to help control that species of weed. So ventenata in Montana. All of the yellow shaded counties, they're orange shaded, is where we have it today. Prior to February of this year, all the starred counties didn't know that they had it in their county. So we were thinking that we were, you know, when I did a survey to the counties, we came back and we figured that there was probably an estimated acreage of 55,000 acres across Montana. Through this last summer, through dealing with some of the weed districts and also my grant coordinator and Jane, doing some surveys in some of these other counties where they're doing other projects, lo and behold, all those starred counties came up with ventenata in them. So it's probably a bigger problem than we think it is. Are we in the early detection rapid response phases for that? Until we get a real good survey done and figure out what is actually out there, we really won't know. So to me, it's quite entailing. I'm pretty sure that Treasure County down there between Rosebud, Bighorn, and Yellowstone, I'm probably pretty sure to say they probably have it, but nobody's looked for it. And I was able to go down to the northwest or northeast group that Brian had talked about and got to talking to those guys, and we think that we should probably do the same thing as a coordinated effort between the two states to put a program together in Montana similar to what they have. And Slade Franklin, who is their state weed coordinator, and Brian, and we got to discuss, and they're discussing the issue, and they're pretty sure that it came from Montana. Because you did see in Brian's little slide there, just that little piece above Montana. And I don't think that's the case, but that's something that we will always discuss and argue about, I'm sure. But so it is a bigger problem than we have. And to make a good example, Carbon County down in southwestern Montana, when I first did this survey in February, they thought they had 5 acres. Come June, when he went out and started looking for it, he had over 1,000 acres. So that's the key to this, is getting people out looking for it. And that's the case with any of the noxious weeds, because once you find it, once you start looking for it, you find more of it. It's just been the case throughout history, I think, with all of our weeds. So, so that's kind of where we're at with ventenata infestations in Montana as of today. Thing that we haven't talked about, and I haven't seen much about this, is the sage-grouse core areas in the state of Montana. All the checkerboarded areas there are prime habitat for sage-grouse. And if we overlaid our map to this map, you would see the green circled areas are infested with ventenata as well as other grasses in those prime areas. Down in the lower left corner of Beaverhead County, I'm assuming that they'll probably find it as well, but that's a prime area for sage-grouse as well. And we do have some funding through the state and private forestry, cooperative forestry program to help with sage-grouse areas in Montana. So the big circled area up on about in the middle of the state, that's mostly Rosebud County, and I see Amy's here today, so hopefully we'll get some projects put together and get some stuff done for the sage-grouse as well. Medusahead. This is our medusahead infestation. This is that little white line going through there, not the road, but the other one going through the middle of the infestation there is the Lake County and Sanders County line that's up in northwestern Montana. We have about 1,800 acres within that yellow shaded area and the other purple areas there. This is all on Confederated Salish Kootenai land as well on the reservation, and they've been excellent to work with. When this was first reported by actually Bryce Christensen out of Missoula County, I think you were hunting, weren't you? Or just out walking. Luckily he was, though, actually, because he knew kind of what to look for and found it. Every agency involved in this has jumped on that. They were funded through the Noxious Weed Trust Fund for a grant to help control and spray those areas in conjunction with Jane and doing plots on there to see if we were making a reduction. We had decided that it was probably going to take us 5 years to control that infestation to a lower level, and luckily it's only taken 3 years. So we're in pretty good shape with that. Above this, to the north of this area, is St. Ignatius and Pablo, Thompson Falls, those areas. 2 years ago, they did a pretty heavily coordinated survey in all those areas. We found a lot of ventenata, and we did not find any more medusahead. So this is Montana's medusahead acreage, at least for now, until, like I say, until people get out and start looking for it, and then who knows. But they've done an excellent job up there. All agencies involved in that have done a great job. And that's all I really have.
Great, thank you, Dave. So I'm going to pose a question to the full group here. If we could talk a bit about vectors. So what are the main vectors that are transporting these invasive grasses in the West? And are there any actions that the governors or the Western Governors Association could take that would help mitigate the transport of these invasive grasses and these vectors?
I guess I would say that, you know, from what we've seen, especially for ventenata, there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's hard to say where it came from, where it's going. We have seen it quite a bit on our roadways this year, in different areas of the state around Helena. If you go west of Helena, it's on our interstate there. It's also on private property. So where did it come from? How did it get here? I don't know. I do think that on another issue of noxious weeds, and that being Phragmites, I would like to think, or like to see the Western Governors Association help the state weed coordinators, not only in Montana, but in our western region, and our county weed district folks, get a better communication effort and organization going with the railroads. We're finding Phragmites where they've put in new ballast materials up on the High Line, and that's the only area that we have right now that has invasive Phragmites. We have a lot of native Phragmites, and we're continuing to survey for those. But I do think the roadways, and I don't know how you control the roadways, I do think the railroads have a huge issue with that. And, you know, any types of those vectors can spread any type of noxious weed. It doesn't matter which one it is.
I don't think we know for sure, but there are some suspects, and probably hay and seeds, so commercially grown seeds that are moved around the state. I think one thing to think about is because these annual grasses have typically not been on state noxious weed lists, they don't fall under the category of restricted species when you think about something like weed seed-free forage, or on a bag of seed, the seed label, you know, as a restricted species, these invasive grasses would not be included. That's changing a bit because some of them are being placed on state noxious weed lists, but historically, the invasive grasses have not been, so they could be easily moved around through forage and seeds.
I think another way that I agree with Dr. Mangold and with Dave that we don't have a real good feel for how it moves. We just know that it moves well. And I think one of the ways that the Western Governors Association could help us is probably leaning on any agency and any opportunity they can for signage, posting, education, so that not only just from an agricultural standpoint, but from sportsmen, recreationalists, all the rest of that especially ventenata, that seed is so easily detached from the plant and disperses so quickly that any disturbance is a vector. And any disturbances causes that. So, in a way, they could help us is, and we, you know, Steve talked about it earlier and whatnot. The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, all those other sportsmen's groups that can help educate their membership and help us post on public lands and on public right-of-ways about that would be very helpful.
Can I add one more? So I think we make a lot of assumptions, like everybody has already said, without really knowing how they're spreading around. And that leads to action sometimes. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. So we had one hay producer that confirmed ventenata in his hay field, and rather than shipping that hay anywhere, he actually voluntarily burned about 8 windrows. And so that, I think that is an illustration of the commitment to people in the area for addressing vectors and pathways for spread. We make the assumption that livestock-related movements and activities probably moved medusahead, but we didn't know that for sure. So we have an undergraduate student that's been sitting down and drawing livestock movement sort of maps with all the people that have known medusahead infestations. And then we're using those to guide our future search efforts as a way to potentially limit the needle in the haystack to where we need to look, but also to evaluate whether or not there's a correlation with moves of livestock from known infested pastures to new areas to try to address whether or not that's a potential pathway and a vector. So I think that there's some opportunities for these vector pathway analyses that we haven't done before, and rather than, I mean, there's a balance between being aggressive and making assumptions and trying to address those potential movement pathways, and then actually doing something about it. I guess to Justin's comment, we have 18 boot brush stations at publicly accessible state lands around Sheridan, Johnson, and Campbell counties now. At each of those boot brush stations, there's an informational bulletin and additional information where people can learn about these species and then also hopefully clean their boots off. Right. But they're probably not going to clean their dog, and they're probably not going to clean their ATV. So I'll stop.
Great. Maybe to build on this idea too, so in terms of early detection and rapid response, are there any lessons that we can learn from land manager responses to medusahead and ventenata?
Well, I think right now we're still in the learning phase. What we're finding is don't assume and don't ignore. That's probably that's the greatest advice I can give anyone, is that don't assume that you're isolated from it. Don't assume that just because you're a closed operation that you've protected yourself, and don't ignore when you're out looking. That's the greatest thing I found, just from working through through Sunlight Ranch, that have that awareness, regardless if you're tearing down the road with something else on your mind. Keep one eye out for that, because it shows up all over. So I think from a land management standpoint, those are the two biggest things. I think the other thing is what I touched on earlier, is start to try and be part of the solution instead of chase the problem. Start looking at your most effective mapping and scouting needs. Start to analyze where you can invest your resources the most. Start to look at your operation, where your operation is going to offer the greatest amount of spread, and treat those areas first, or change your operations in that area first. It's again to that holistic analysis of how you're operating. I think that's, from what we know now as we're getting our arms around it, that is the first priorities that a person should put in place.
I've been very surprised and pleasantly surprised by the amount of interest that both private landowners and managers of public lands have taken in Montana in the last 2 years about dealing with ventenata. I would say 20 years ago, when I first started studying invasive plants, we didn't focus as much on early detection and rapid response. That is not the case at all with medusahead and ventenata from what I've seen over the last 2 summers. People are very excited about these 2 species and actually taking action to try to manage these small patches of the mosaics that Justin mentioned early. And I think, we've learned from some of our neighbors. Ventenata has been a problem in Oregon, Idaho, eastern Washington for probably the last 5 to 10 years. They've been watching this plant increase, and we have learned from that. And we've been talking about medusahead and ventenata for 10 years now, and now we're seeing it on our landscape, and I think people are prepped and ready to do something about it.
Okay, I'd like to give an opportunity for a question from the audience if we have one. Great, we have one over here.
Thanks. I have a question for Dave, Josh Atwood with the Hawaii Invasive Species Council. I was really interested to hear how actively the state noxious weed list is utilized in Montana. We have one in Hawaii, but it's pretty tightly connected to private property access, and the list hasn't been updated in over 25 years. I was also really interested, and you mentioned it kind of casually, but I know Christy and I sat up a little straighter when you used the words Noxious Weed Trust Fund. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about what regulatory authorities are associated with your state noxious weed list, and then if you could elaborate a little bit on how the trust fund came to be and how it operates.
Sure. So I think from our weed perspective, or the noxious weed list perspective, it's in the County Weed Control Act that gives the authority to the counties for noxious weed management across Montana in their own individual counties. The state has regulatory authority for listing noxious weeds in that statute and then by rule. And that's how we've come up with our process of listing noxious weeds in the state. We have them broken into, and we just did this probably, I guess, 7-8 years ago. We put it into a priority system. So priority 1A weeds are weeds that we don't either have in the state or very limited infestations, such as Dyer's woad, yellow star thistle, medusahead. So we, especially with Dyer's woad, you know, that's a success story in itself, because we're down to counting plants in Montana for Dyer's woad, and yellow star thistle being on that list as well. I can say right now that we do not have yellow star thistle in the state of Montana. We've had about 17 sightings of it, or infestations throughout the state, and every time that we've had one, everybody's come together. County weed districts from that surrounding area come together. They do a survey. They do either hand pulling or herbicide controls, and it's just worked out really, really well for us. It is in Montana, it is illegal for anybody to propagate noxious weeds on their land, so that does go back to the landowners as well. Unless, of course, they're in working condition with the county weed coordinator and have a weed management plan on file in their office. Probably half of the counties in the state do enforce enforcement measures on private landowners. Others don't either have the funding or don't have a full-time coordinator, and some prefer to do it through education and outreach to try to get those people aware of what's happening in their state. So kind of where we're at with that. The Noxious Weed Trust Fund has been a godsend for Montana, actually. Back in 1985, it was introduced through the Montana State Legislature. It was enacted in 1985. It provides funding for local cooperative management projects, education projects, and research projects in the state. We have a 1.5% that is taxed on all vehicles, registration fees, and that's what basically runs that trust fund. We're getting anywhere between $1.5 and $1.7 million annually for that. So it's been a really good program. We do have a permanent trust fund as well that went along with that in 1985. We've now built that up to $10 million, and it's capped at $10 million. So any money above that, we bring it back into off of interest. We bring that back into the department to help run that program. So on an annual basis, we are awarding between $2 million and $2.5 million annually for noxious weeds in the state of Montana through that trust fund. It was pretty progressive thinking back then, if you think about it, 1985, for those guys to start doing that. Today's world, I don't think we'd see that. I really don't. Because one, it's a fee, and two, it's hard to get people into that situation with especially with noxious weeds. But it's a well-worked program here in the state, and I know a lot of states envy what we have because of that trust fund. And we also get, because I think of our trust fund program that we have, we also get a lot of funding through state and private forestry, cooperative forestry program funding. Since 2000, we've gotten over $11 million to grant out to other agents, other people and other agencies. So.
Well, great. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but can you please join me in thanking everybody for the panel?